Oh, hey, I was just doing a little bit of coloring at my daughter's new desk. Maybe you'd like to see how I made it. I've always been drawn to mid-century modern furniture and have been itching to do a project like this, but to make things a little bit more interesting, I'm making almost all of the cuts with my track saw. So stick around to see how the project goes and learn what I would do a little bit differently the next time around. And while you watch that, I'm gonna get back to my coloring.
Whenever I'm not using the project table, I lay down a sheet of foam insulation to cut on top of, and with two sections of track joined together, I cut a wide strip that the top will be made from. I then attach the rip guides to the track and cut 4 strips that will be used to make the base. You'll see me using the Craig ACS throughout this project, and if you want to learn more about it, hit the link that just popped up to watch my unboxing video. Also, all of the tools and materials that I used for this project will be linked in the description below. With the project table set up, I cut the strips to rough length. I like using a clamp at the end of my boards when making cuts like this. It speeds up the process and ensures that all the pieces are being cut to the same length. The legs and cross members that make up the base are both 1.5 inches thick, and before I glue the pieces together, I take a minute and just make sure that there aren't any visible defects on the surface veneer. If so, I flip that board over so that the defects are to the inside. Whenever I glue up pieces like this, I like to just pour the glue from the bottle and use a spreader. This makes the process much faster than simply using a brush. For the legs and cross members, I made a template from scrap 1/4 inch plywood. I simply drew out the pattern from my plans onto the wood and then cut to the lines over at the project table. The trick here though is to remember to change the depth stop on the saw and not cut all the way through the table. Before cutting the pieces to final size, I place a versus stop in the table to help keep the pieces from moving around. Also, I set another leg blank under the back side of the track to keep the track level while cutting. So here I'm making this cut in 2 passes, but the saw has plenty of power to make this cut in a single pass if you prefer. With the first side cut, I flip the board around and cut the opposite side to size, again taking 2 passes to complete the cut. Here I've added the miter guide to the project table and have set up to cut half laps. Curve cutting the stock is a fast way to make half lap joints that requires minimal cleanup with a chisel afterward. So this process is actually the first thing I'd do differently if I built this desk again. Instead of gluing up 2 full-size blanks, I would have cut one piece with the shoulder of the half lap already established. I'd then glue that to a larger piece, and after this the 2 pieces could then be cut to final size, and that would eliminate the need for curve cutting the half lap altogether. For the half lap and the cross members, I set the miter gauge and made the first cut just to the left of my layout line. And that thumbs up is because I hit the depth dead on in the first pass. For the second cut, I line up and cut to the inside of the left line. I did this by plunging the blade down to visualize where the blade would cut. And note to self, next time remember to tape the back side of the cut to prevent all that wood from blowing out. To finish out the half lap, I curve cut the remaining material and then head over to my workbench with a sharp chisel to clean up the joints. With the half laps cleaned up, it's time to see how the fit came out. And I'm gonna say that's good to go. While I clean up the remaining half laps, I wanted to take a quick minute and tell you about the sponsor and inspiration for this project. My friends over at Craig Tool challenged me to build something with the ACS as the primary cutting tool. So my hope for this video is to inspire y'all to think about what other cool projects you could build with the ACS. There's just something oddly satisfying about breaking away curve cut material, so just for kicks, I had to throw another one of those in there. You're welcome. With the half laps cleaned up, I check everything one last time and make sure all the joints are tight. The main thing I'm focusing on with this glue up is that the pieces pull together once I apply clamping pressure and not apart. I found that a trigger clamp held at the slightest angle will pull the pieces together well and keep the joint tight. After the glue is dried, I head back over to the ACS and trim off the excess material. This is done in short order since all I have to do is line up the edge of my piece with the edge of my track. To cut each leg assembly to the same length, I use the repetitive stops along with the joining bar to locate the leg assembly against while cutting. Now just one more test fit to make sure things are good, and we're ready to move on. To add the accent circles on the legs, I locate the center of each joint by drawing a reference line and then marking across the corners. Then over at the drill press, I use a Forstner bit to drill the holes that will later be filled. For the top of this desk, I wanted the grain to be continuous at each edge. To do this, I planned out my cuts so that the grain on the top would wrap around both sides. If this doesn't make total sense, no worries, I have that all laid out on a cut sheet in the plans. With the top and bottom pieces clamped together in the same orientation that they'll be when the top is assembled, I cut away the corner where I want the epoxy accent to be. Also, just for a little extra insurance, I used the track clamps to hold the track secure while making the cut. Before cutting the right side to the final size, I wanted to make sure that I had the angle just right, so first I made a test cut at the end of my board and checked it against the top and bottom pieces. With that done, I made a minor adjustment to the angle and then cut the piece to final length. I'm now ready to make my molds for the epoxy pours. For this, I used melamine and made the molds just larger than the pieces I needed them to fit. I ran a bead of caulk under each side before nailing them in place with 2-inch 16-gauge nails. You can screw these molds together if you prefer, but nails held everything in place just fine. Once the molds are built, I caulk all of the seams on both sides and smoothed out any excess caulk. Since plywood is not as flat as we'd all like to pretend it is, I also ran a bead of caulk under each piece to keep the epoxy from pooling under them. And I'm not sure if it made any difference, but I also used a couple cans of finish as weights to hold the pieces down while the epoxy cured. I used Total Boat thick-set epoxy with Black Diamond liquid fire pigment. For the half gallon of epoxy I used, I went with 42 grams of pigment. Now, this is on the heavy side of the pigment to epoxy ratio, but I wanted to make sure that the drawer slides I'll be using won't be seen through the epoxy. Well, here goes nothing. And if you're wondering, I poured these 3 pieces in one mold so that the pattern in the epoxy would also wrap around the right side of the top, just like the grain in the wood. To make the pattern in the epoxy, I used a toothpick and tried my best to not introduce any excess air bubbles. Just to play it safe though, I hit it with a heat gun afterward to pop any bubbles that formed. To wreck the mold, I grabbed my dead blow hammer and just went to town. By just using the caulk and nails to hold the form together, I was able to disassemble this mold fairly quickly. Before separating the bottom sheet, I thought it best to cut the sections apart since the epoxy and plywood aren't one continuous piece. And to separate the plywood from the melamine bottom, I used a few wooden wedges and gradually worked them closer to the epoxy until the pieces just came free. To clean things up, I made a makeshift router box to plane down the excess epoxy. You could also use a sander to do this, but I felt like this would be a little bit faster and probably less likely to cut through the surface veneer on the plywood. So what I did was first set the piece only on the plywood portion on some scrap wood blocks, so that way the epoxy section wouldn't tilt the piece out of parallel. After this first side was surfaced, I cleaned the table off, flipped the piece over, and surfaced the other side. With all the pieces for the top surfaced, I now cut them to their final lengths and widths by first cleaning up the excess epoxy on the sides, and then using the repetitive stop and joining bars to cut a parallel edge on each of the side pieces. I also cut the top and bottom pieces to their final dimensions, triple checking for square and making sure that they are the same size before moving on. So now comes the fun part. I consecutively set the side of each piece flush with the track and cut it at 45 degrees. You'll notice that I move a set of versa stops behind the piece when cutting the opposite side at 45 degrees. I did this so that I can maintain a consistent reference surface, which reduces the likelihood of any out of square tolerance buildup there may be as I go through the different cuts to make these pieces. To cut the chamfer on the front of each piece for the top, I set the edge behind the track before cutting the desired angle. If you've ever made a small mitered box and used tape to help glue it together, this will be familiar territory for you. I first tape the outside of the box together to double check the unit is square and void of any discrepancies. Next, I lay strips of tape along the inside of the joints to minimize any glue squeeze out that may need to be cleaned up later. With the glue spread out, I fold up the box and tape it shut. In addition to tape, I use band clamps to evenly clamp the joints tight, and with the last clamp in place, I go ahead and peel the tape inside of the box before the glue has a chance to cure and make removing the tape more difficult. To make the drawer box, I grab some 1/2-inch plywood and make one full-length cut. Back at the project table, I cut the strip into 2 pieces. They'll make up the front, back, and sides of the drawer box. Using the repetitive stops and joining bar again, I set up to rip the strips to width. Now you'll see that I'm making 2 cuts, and this is so that each piece is trimmed to the exact same width. The drawer slides that I'm using require a notch to be cut and a hole to be drilled in the back of the drawer box. After laying out for these features, I first grab my jigsaw to cut away this section. And now with my drill and a Forstner bit, I drill that hole that's needed. Now I'm ready to cut the groove for the drawer bottom. After adjusting the depth of cut on the saw, I set up the repetitive stops to make the cuts on the inside of each drawer piece. For the drawer bottom, I'm using a piece of 1/4-inch plywood. And to assemble the drawer box, I went with pocket hole joinery, and I used the new 720 pocket hole jig from Craig. I switched to the micro drill guide since I'm working with 1/2-inch thick material. And if you want to know more about this jig, hit the card above to watch my unboxing video. While running in the screws, I've found the easiest method is to hold everything together with a set of parallel clamps. For this box, I'm using 3/4-inch long, fine thread panhead screws. I went with Blum drawer slides for this build, and they sell a drill guide for installing these front pieces, but with self-drilling screws, I didn't have any trouble with the wood splintering. I just ran the screws right in. I used my sander to clean up the excess epoxy on the legs, and this process went fairly quick. To attach the legs to the top, I lay out and drill for joint connector bolts on the drill press. Unless you have a counterboring bit, usually drilling the larger hole first and then following up with a smaller bit for your through hole is not only safer, but it'll actually produce a better result as well. With the holes drilled in the base, I center it on the underside of the desktop by simply scooching it around until my measurements are consistent from left, right, front, and back. And now using a punch, I transfer those holes to the underside of the desktop. I know you've probably all seen this one before, but a little bit of painter's tape wrapped around a drill bit gives me a guide as to how deep I need to drill for my threaded inserts. Next up, I install the threaded inserts flush with the surface. Countersinking the holes makes this a touch easier if needed. While I sand is a perfect time to share what else I'd do differently with this build if I had to do it over again. I seriously considered applying a coat of finish to all of the parts before pouring the epoxy. My concern was that the pigment would discolor the wood deeper than I'd be able to sand out before going through the surface veneer of the plywood. Well, turns out I should have followed my gut. I was able to sand away the majority of the staining, but I would have gotten a more crisp transition between the wood and epoxy if I'd first sealed the grain with a coat of finish. Next up, I temporarily install the drawer slides so that I can get the proper spacing for the drawer front. To center the drawer front, I first grab my vintage deck of Delta Airlines playing cards and shim the drawer front until it's centered in the opening. I then peel back the film on the double-faced tape and press the drawer front against the drawer box. Now ever so carefully, I slowly open the drawer and clamp the drawer front in place while I screw the drawer box and drawer front together. While I attach the base and top, I want to point out one thing about the dimensions of this desk real quick. Since this was built for my daughter, the clearance under the cross member is on the low side at 21 inches. In the plans, I list a few ways to adjust the clearance under the desk and how you can modify the design to fit what you may need. When I recently refinished the cabinets in my laundry room, I really became a believer in this masking film, and now just about any time I need to mask something off, like the inside of this drawer box for instance, it's what I grab for first. To finish the desk, I used my Apollo turbine system and applied 2 coats of General Finishes flat high performance top coat. One thing that I really like about this finish is that it's also brushable, so if you don't have a turbine unit, you can still use this finish and get great results. But I had no idea I was striking so many ninja poses spraying this desk. Maybe I'm onto something here.
Oh, so what did you think? If you like the desk, I have plans that are linked in the description below. Thank you so much for watching, and I really hope you enjoyed the video.
Ah, you're still there. Awesome. Hey, if you enjoyed this video, I got another one queued up for you right here. And if you want other awesome content from me, check out those. Anyways, hope you enjoyed the video. Please hit the like and subscribe. And until next time, have fun making something.